Escape from Wolfhaven Castle, Chapter 9. Battle with the Bogmen. Eleanor could hardly see a thing. She stumbled forward, almost tripping on her skirts and falling. Quinn whispered to Tom, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he answered, dashing his arm across his eyes. I just hope they don't hurt Mam." "She's so brave," Quinn whispered back. "She may be small, but she's fierce," Tom's voice cracked. They hurried down a dark passage, lit only by the occasional slash of light through a crack in the stone. Fergus was running ahead, his nose to the ground. When he turned looking for Tom, his eyes glowed green. Through the wall came the muffled sounds of battle. Clangs, screams and cries, then horribly close, through a crack in the stone, a sniffling, snuffling sound. They all ran as quietly as they could in the dimness. The passageway turned sharply, then up spiral stairs as steep as a ladder. Eleanor scrambled up, gasping for breath. She had never run so far or fast in her life. "Where does this lead us?" Quinn whispered, as the steps wound higher and higher into darkness. "I've no idea," Tom whispered back. "But we can't go back. We must keep going forward." They passed a small alcove, and Tom suddenly stopped. "There's a door here. Shall we see where it leads?" Without waiting for an answer, he turned the handle and swung the door open. It creaked. Tom stopped, then, very slowly, eased it open wider. It creaked more loudly. He stepped through, Fergus pushing past him. "All's clear," he whispered. Quinn crept through, and Eleanor followed. She found herself in a part of the castle she did not recognise. It was a round room with a huge fireplace at one end and narrow window slits breaking up the stone walls. Once the secret door swung shut, it was impossible to see where it was. Eleanor wondered how many other secret doors there were in the castle. Rushes covered the floor, and the walls were hung with all sorts of weapons. "The guard room," Tom whispered in surprise. "Quick, let's arm ourselves while we can." He took down a dagger in a scabbard and tossed it to Quinn, who swiftly belted it to her waist on the opposite side of her black witch's knife. Tom found another dagger for Eleanor. "Oh no, I couldn't," she protested, pushing the dagger away with both hands. "You must," Quinn replied fiercely, taking the dagger from Tom and thrusting it into Eleanor's hands. "You may have to fight, my lady, else we'll all be taken captive." "Ladies don't fight," her governess said in her mind. But Eleanor was doing many things of which her governess would not approve. She took the dagger and strapped it to her golden belt with shaking hands. Tom took a dagger for himself and grabbed a coil of rope. Then, with an effort that made him grunt and grow red in the face, he bent and strung the longbow and put an arrow to it. "Can you shoot?" Quinn asked him. "Not very well," he answered, "though every time I go to the forest I practice best I can with an old bow and arrows I made myself." He raised the bow and arrow and squinted along the arrow. "This is much better." "Anything else we should take?" Quinn asked. "We might have to fight our way out." A shudder ran over Eleanor. "You should have shoes, Quinn," Tom said, looking at the witch's girl's bare feet. "The forest is filled with thorns, thistles and sharp stones." Quinn raised her chin. "A witch draws power from the earth. I can never cut myself off from that." "Fine, you can do it. Can you do anything useful with that power? Summon a fireball or two, or make us invisible?" "Magic doesn't work that way." "Oh, of course it doesn't." "Well then, what can you do?" Lots of stuff, Quinn snapped. Stuff a thickhead like you could never understand. Well, mutter a spell or two and get us out of here, Tom snapped back. Quinn's face was white. I wish I could. If only I was ready to find my witch's staff. But until I do, I can do nothing. Oh, Tom, we need to go and see the Grand Teller. Arwen will know what to do. We can't, he said shortly. We need to get out of here as fast as we can. Quinn and Tom stared at each other angrily. Then she tossed back her thick mane of curly hair and began to run out of the room. Coming? She mocked over her shoulder. Tom raced after her and overtook her on the steps, Fergus bounding along beside him. Eleanor followed timidly. As they hurried down the stairs towards the inner ward, Quinn turned to Eleanor, her narrow face full of sympathy. I know you're afraid, she whispered, but fear is the worst of your enemies. Try and be brave. Eleanor swallowed hard and nodded. As they descended the staircase, the sound of fighting grew louder. They came to the doorway and peeked out into the courtyard. Armoured knights battled against castle guards. The bogmen scuttled about, spears thrusting mercilessly. Mist roiled everywhere, turning orange here and there, where flaming torches had been stuck in brackets on the walls. We have to sneak past, Tom whispered. Let's head for the garden gate. I know where the spare key is kept. They crept out the door and along the wall, keeping close together. Tom kept his hand on Fergus's collar. They had almost reached the archway that led to the garden when Eleanor saw a mass of Wolfhaven folk being herded through the inner keep towards the dungeons, guarded by unknown knights. They were bound together by chains, manacles gripping their wrists and ankles. Sir Kevin was fighting every step of the way, 4 knights struggling to hold him back. The Chamberlain was crawling along on his knees, imploring the bogmen to keep away. Mistress Pippin's face was grim and bruised. She struggled to free herself of the 2 men who held her. Then, with horror, Eleanor saw her own father, Lord Wolfgang, chained and manacled like the rest. Father, she whimpered. At once one of the bogmen raised his head and sniffed. His eyeless head swiveled towards her. Then he began to run. Slap, slap, slap went his feet on the stone. Sniff, sniff, sniff went his flaring nostrils. Tom, Eleanor cried. Help! Tom bent his bow and sent an arrow whizzing into the bogman's shoulder. The creature simply pulled it out and kept running towards them. Quinn jumped in front of Eleanor, pulling free her dagger and her black witch's knife. Tom fitted another arrow to his bow. Then another boy leapt in front of the bogman, and his sword flashed down. A withered arm spun away into the darkness. The bogman lurched on, now armless. The boy made another desperate swipe. He sliced off one of the bogmen's legs. The creature fell and could not rise, but wriggled forward, reaching for Eleanor's ankle. She screamed and scrambled away. On hearing her scream, all the bogmen's heads whipped around. They began to lope towards her. The boy jumped in front of her, using his sword to chop off the crawling bogman's head. At last, the creature went still. Tom raised his bow, firing arrow after arrow into the bogmen. They simply pulled the arrows out and kept running. Quinn bent and picked up the spear the dead creature had dropped and flung it as hard as she could. It went straight through the empty eye socket of one of the attackers, and he fell silently. Fergus snarled and leapt, taking down another. The unknown boy's sword flashed as he swiped it sideways. It got snagged in the neck of one of the bogmen. The boy grunted and tried to pull his sword free, but then more of the beasts were upon him, spears raised high. He lifted his shield, protecting his neck and shoulders. It was emblazoned with the writhing shape of a red dragon. Tom jumped up and pulled one of the flaming torches from the wall. He swiped it from side to side. The bogmen leapt back. Tom pursued them with the torch, and they retreated, giving Quinn time to help drag back the boy who had helped them fight. His hair gleamed red under the flare of the torches, and Eleanor recognised him at once. He was Lord Sebastian Byrne, the squire who had tumbled into her bedchamber on the night she had met Tom. "Oh, it's you," Tom said unenthusiastically. "You!" Sebastian cried. "If I'd known it was you, potboy, I wouldn't have." Just then the torch in Tom's hand began to splutter and smoke. The bogmen surged forward. Tom threw the dying torch in their faces. "Run!" Through the archway they raced, and along the narrow passageway into the inner ward. Bogmen loped after them, spears held high. The 4 children swerved, spun, ran and sidestepped, bogmen hot on their heels. It was like a mad game of modball. Whenever they passed a torch, one or other of the children would grab it and fling it back at their relentless pursuers. Each time the creatures flinched and retreated, but it only gained them a few seconds. As Eleanor and Tom ran towards the shelter of the garden, they collided with someone in the darkness. He went down with a great clang and dropped the sack he was carrying. Quinn ran up, a flaming torch in her hand. The light fell upon the pale face of Jack Spry and glittered upon the silver plates and candlesticks that had rolled out of his sack. The boy scooped them back up and thrust them into his sack. "Watch where you're going," he growled at Tom, before running off towards the garden gate. "Wait! They're my father's candlesticks!" Eleanor cried. But Jack Spry had disappeared into the darkness. A spear whizzed past Tom's head. Quinn waved the flaming torch at the bogmen, keeping them back, as Sebastian swung his sword wildly. Fergus snarled and lunged. The smell of the marshes was strong. The bogmen closed in on them once more, waiting for the torch to sizzle and go out. "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, the dagger shaking in her hands. "We'll never make it to the gate," Tom panted. "The Grand Tallis house," Quinn gasped. "This way." They flung the torch into the bogsmen's faces, then turned and ran towards the immense oak tree that grew like a gnarled giant in the centre of the garden. The tree's branches were hung with tiny paper lanterns, like fireflies. Suddenly a tiny door in the trunk of the tree swung open, casting out a fan of radiance. The Grand Teller stood there, beckoning them inside, her silver hair hanging loose down her back. 4 children and 1 big dog raced past her. The Grand Teller then banged on the ground with her staff, and suddenly every paper lantern on the tree burst into flame. The bogmen fell back. The door slammed shut. Thud, thud, thud. Spears hammered the door. Eleanor, looking around the small room inside the tree's trunk, realised with horror that they were trapped.